I grabbed my coat off the hook by the front door, the one I'd hung there 31 years ago when my husband and I first moved in, and I walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. Not because I was dramatic, because if I had opened my mouth, I would have said something I couldn't take back. And at 63 years old, I had finally learned the difference between words that set you free and words that just make a mess you spend years cleaning up. The drive to my sister's house in Knoxville took 4 hours. I cried for the first 40 minutes. Then I turned on the radio, found a station playing old country, and I let Dolly Parton carry me the rest of the way. That was the day my son-in-law told my daughter she had to choose between him and me. She chose him. Let me back up, because none of this will make sense without the beginning. And the beginning, like most beginnings that matter, started long before anyone realized something was ending. My name is Winifred. Winnie, to the people who love me. I spent 32 years building a property management company in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make the cover of Forbes. We managed residential properties, apartment complexes, single-family rentals, a few small commercial spaces along the river. My late husband, Charles, handled the maintenance side. I handled everything else. Leases, tenant relations, accounting, vendor contracts, the phone calls at 2 a.m. when a pipe burst in Unit 4B. When Charles passed, a heart attack 4 years ago last March, sudden and without warning, the way the worst things always are, I kept going. What else was I supposed to do? The company was our life. It was also our retirement. We had 14 employees, 47 properties under management, and a reputation in this city that took 3 decades to build. My daughter, Renata, had joined the business about 6 years before Charles died. She has a good head for numbers, always did, even as a little girl, counting change at yard sales and negotiating prices with grown adults at age 9. I was proud to have her, genuinely proud. We worked well together in those early years. She modernized our software systems, brought in some younger clients, pushed us into managing short-term rentals before most companies in our area figured out that was where the money was going. Then she married Preston. Preston came from money, or more accurately, Preston came from a family that had once had money and spent a great deal of energy pretending they still did. He had an MBA from a school I'd never heard of and opinions about everything, delivered with the kind of confidence that doesn't come from being right very often, but from never being told you're wrong. He was charming at the rehearsal dinner. He was charming at the rehearsal dinner. He was charming at Christmas. He was charming right up until the moment he decided he didn't need to be anymore. He started coming into the office about 18 months after the wedding. Just visiting at first. Then sitting in on meetings. Then offering suggestions. And this happened so gradually I still have trouble pinpointing exactly when running them. I noticed the small things first. Vendor contracts being renegotiated without my sign-off. A new property management software system that nobody consulted me on before purchasing. Staff meetings scheduled during times he knew I had standing appointments with our accountant. Little erosions, the kind that look like nothing individually but add up to a landslide. When I raised it with Renata, she said I was being sensitive. When I raised it a second time, she said I was struggling with Charles being gone and maybe I should talk to someone. The third time, she didn't say much of anything. She just looked at me with this expression I didn't recognize. Patient, careful, a little distant, and I realized with a cold feeling in my chest that she'd practiced it. Someone had coached her on how to look at me. I knew then that this was no longer just her husband overstepping. This was a plan. I started keeping records. Not because I'm a suspicious person by nature. Charles would have told you I'm almost willfully trusting, to a fault. But because something in me that had been doing business for 32 years recognized the pattern. So I documented, printed emails, kept a notebook in my desk drawer at home with dates and details. Asked my accountant, a woman named Sandra who had worked with us for 15 years. No, wait, I need a different name. Her name was Ruth. Ruth had worked with us for 15 years, and she was the first person to tell me, quietly over coffee one Thursday morning, that something wasn't right with the books. Not obviously wrong, not embezzlement in the dramatic, obvious sense, but money moving between accounts in patterns she couldn't fully trace. Expenses categorized in ways that benefited Preston's separate consulting LLC. Small enough to explain away individually, large enough, added together, to matter. I thanked her. I went home. I sat at Charles's old desk in the study, and I looked at the photograph of the two of us at the ribbon cutting for our first office, 1993. Bad haircuts, enormous smiles, and I made a decision. I called a lawyer the next morning. His name was Garrett, and he had handled our business contracts for a decade. He listened to everything I told him, asked careful questions, and then was quiet for a moment before he said, "Winnie, are you prepared for this to get very uncomfortable?" I told him I'd been uncomfortable for 2 years already. I was ready to do something about it. What followed was 3 months of quiet work. Garrett filed some protective documents. I had Ruth do a formal forensic review of the accounts, which she had the authority to initiate under our partnership agreement. A document, I should mention, that Preston had apparently never read carefully enough to understand what it actually allowed me to do. I began the process of legally separating my ownership share into its own entity. A step I should have taken years before but hadn't, because I never imagined I'd need to, and I said nothing. I went to work every day. I sat through meetings where Preston talked over me. I smiled when he introduced me as Renata's mother to new clients instead of as the founder of the company. I let him think it was working, that I was fading, that I was just a tired old woman counting down to retirement. I have never been good at giving up. It's not something they teach you in business school. I never went to business school, but it's the thing that kept us going through the recession in 2008, through losing our 2 biggest clients in 1 year, through a lawsuit from a contractor that cost us 18 months of sleep and legal fees I don't like to think about. You figure out how to stay standing. That's the whole thing. That's the whole lesson. The day everything changed was a Tuesday in October. Preston had scheduled what he called a strategic realignment meeting. His language, not mine, with the full staff and 2 potential investors he'd been cultivating. I found out about it through one of our property managers, a young man named Terrence, who had been with us for 4 years, and who, I think, felt guilty about what he'd seen happening. He mentioned it in passing, almost like he assumed I knew. I didn't know. I hadn't been invited. I went anyway. I walked into the conference room, the same conference room where Charles and I had celebrated our 10th anniversary as a company, where we'd hired our first employees, where I had cried in private after we lost a major contract and then walked back in and told the team we were going to be fine, and I sat down at the head of the table, not a seat along the side. The head? Preston walked in 3 minutes later and stopped when he saw me. "Winnie," he said with that careful smile, "I wasn't sure you'd be feeling up to this." I told him I was feeling just fine, thank you. He glanced at Renata, who was sitting to his left. She didn't look at me. She was looking at the table. "This is more of a forward planning session," he said, "for where the company is heading. We thought it might be easier if I wasn't here," I finished for him. "I appreciate the concern, but as the majority stakeholder, I thought I should probably attend." The room got very quiet. One of the investors, a man named Dale, who I'd briefly met at a Chamber of Commerce event, glanced between us with the politely alarmed expression of someone who has just realized they've walked into something that has nothing to do with them. Preston recovered quickly. He always did, I'll give him that. "Of course," he said, "the more the merrier." He sat down. The meeting began. And for the next 45 minutes, I let him run it, let him present his vision for the company, expanded into 3 new markets, new branding, a restructured leadership team. I listened carefully. I asked 1 or 2 polite questions. I watched Dale's face while Preston talked. Then, when Preston opened the floor to discuss transition of day-to-day operations, I opened the folder I'd brought with me and I placed Garrett's documents on the table. "Before we get into that," I said, "I thought it might be useful to clarify the current ownership structure. just so everyone is working from the same information. I don't need to describe in detail what happened next. It wasn't a movie scene. Nobody shouted. No one threw anything. It was more like watching the air slowly go out of a room. Preston read the documents. He read them again. He asked where these had come from. I told him my attorney had prepared them and that copies had already been filed with the state. The two investors left shortly after. Politely, with handshakes, but they left. Preston said very little after that. He looked at Renata. She was still not looking at me. I picked up my folder. I said I'd have Garrett reach out to their attorney to begin the formal separation of assets. I thanked the staff for their time, and then I walked out of the conference room and straight out of the building, got in my car, and drove to Ruth's office where I sat across from her desk and finally let myself exhale. "Well," she said. "It went fine," I said. She handed me a cup of coffee. "You're shaking." "I know," I said. "I'm allowed." The next year was hard in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had protected my ownership share. I had the documentation. Legally, I was in a strong position, but there is a difference between being right and being okay, and those two things don't always arrive at the same time. Renata didn't call me for 4 months. 4 months. I counted. I won't pretend I didn't cry over it, because I did, in the way you cry when you're past the dramatic part of grief and into the quiet, hollow part that doesn't announce itself, just settles in like weather. My sister helped. She drove up from Knoxville twice. My friend Helen, who I've known since our kids were in elementary school together, took me to lunch every week without fail, even when I wasn't good company. The staff at the company, most of them, stayed. Terrence stayed. Ruth stayed. That mattered more than I can say. I had to decide what to do with my half of the business. I could have forced a buyout. Garrett told me I had strong grounds, but a forced buyout takes time and money and energy, and something in me, maybe just the part that was 63 years old and tired of fighting, didn't want to spend the next 2 years in depositions. What I did instead was something that surprised even me. I started fresh. I had contacts, 32 years of contacts. Property owners, contractors, vendors, banks. I had a reputation that Preston had not managed to damage, because reputation, unlike a lot of things, is not something you can steal from someone by controlling their calendar. I quietly reached out to 3 of our smaller property owners who I knew were unhappy with the direction the company had taken. I had conversations, I made arrangements. 6 months after I walked out of that conference room, I opened a new property management company. I named it Ellsworth & Company, for Charles, his mother's maiden name, the name he was proudest of. Small office. 2 employees to start. 17 properties under management. I was 63 years old and I was starting over, which sounds like the kind of thing people say to sound inspirational, but in practice means you are doing your own billing again, answering emails at 10 at night, eating lunch at your desk because there is no one else to handle things if you step away. It is humbling and exhausting, and I will tell you honestly, more alive than I had felt in years. By the end of the first year, we had 31 properties. By the end of the second, 44. We brought on 2 more staff members. Word travels in this city. When you do things right, when you answer the phone, when you show up when a tenant has a problem, when you treat the people who work for you like human beings, word travels. I didn't think about Preston much during those years. I thought about Renata. I thought about calling her, and I thought about what I would say if she called me. I had a version of the conversation in my head that I revised 100 times, the way you do when you're not sure whether you're rehearsing or just refusing to let something go. She called on a Sunday afternoon in March, about 2.5 years after the conference room. She didn't apologize right away. I don't know what I expected. I think I'd imagined something more dramatic. But she just said, "Mom," in a voice I recognized from when she was small, and I said, "Hi, baby." And we were quiet for a moment. She told me things hadn't been going well. I didn't ask her to elaborate. She told me she was sorry. She said it twice, and the second time her voice broke a little, and I had to put my hand over the phone so she wouldn't hear me. I told her I loved her. Because I did. I do. That never changed. We met for lunch the following Saturday, a diner in East Brainerd we used to go to when she was in high school. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long, which I recognized, because I had looked that way too. She didn't say much about Preston. I didn't push. There are things that are your child's to tell you when they're ready, and things that are yours to wait for. What I found out over the next few months, in pieces, was that the business had not gone well after I left. The investors had not materialized. 3 of our largest property owners had taken their contracts elsewhere. To me, as it happened, though I hadn't pursued them, they'd come to me. The strategic realignment had cost more than it returned. Preston had hired 2 senior managers who were expensive and ineffective, and let go of 2 employees who had been essential, one of whom was Terrence, which I still find infuriating. The company was still operating when Renata called me, but barely. And Preston had been talking, she told me carefully, about possibly reaching out to me, about whether there was a role for him at Ellsworth & Co. I set down my coffee cup. A role, I said. He mentioned possibly a consulting arrangement, she said, and she was watching my face in that careful way that told me she already knew what I was going to say. I thought about it for a long moment. About the Sunday mornings I'd spent alone those first 2 years. About Terrence, who I had since hired and who was now one of my best people. About Charles's photograph on the desk in my home office and the ribbon cutting in 1993, and all the years of 2 a.m. phone calls. Renata, I said, I love you. I am so glad you called me, and I will always, always be your mother. I paused, but I will not be working with Preston. She nodded slowly. She didn't look surprised. I think she had known. I think she'd needed to hear me say it. What I did not expect was that 3 weeks later, Preston would call Garrett directly and inquire about an entry-level property manager position at Ellsworth & Co. Not consulting. Entry-level. Garrett called me and I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after he told me, just sitting with it. The thing about running a business for 32 years is that you make decisions based on what is actually true, not on what would make a good story. The true thing was that Preston was not someone I could trust. The true thing was that having him inside my company would undo things I had worked very hard to build. The true thing was that you can forgive someone and still understand that forgiveness does not require you to hand them another opportunity to cause you harm. I told Garrett to decline, politely and without elaboration. I heard from Renata that he eventually found work with a property company in Nashville. I hope it goes well for him there. I mean that without sarcasm, which has taken me some time to be able to say honestly. Renata and I have lunch every other Saturday now. She left the original company, what's left of it, about 8 months ago and is working for a real estate firm downtown. She looks less tired. Last month, she brought her 2 kids, my grandchildren, 8 and 5, and we sat in a booth at that same diner in East Brainerd for 3 hours, and the 5-year-old spilled chocolate milk on my sleeve, and it was one of the best afternoons I've had in years. She asked me recently whether I ever regretted not fighting harder, not forcing the full buyout, not going after Preston more aggressively when I had the grounds to do it. I thought about it the way I try to think about things now. Honestly, not to produce a tidy answer. What I told her was this: I regret the years I spent not seeing what was happening in front of me because I wanted to believe everything was fine. I regret not acting sooner. Not for my sake, but because earlier action might have protected the people who worked for us. I don't regret the way I left, and I don't regret what I built after. The view from 65. I turned 65 last September, something I was not sure I would feel like celebrating and then found I very much did, is different than I expected. People talk about getting older like it's a narrowing, like the world gets smaller. What I have found, and I can only speak for myself, is that the things that aren't real fall away, and what you're left with is clearer. Harder in some ways, and simpler in others. Charles used to say that the best business advice he ever got was from his father, who told him, "Build something you'd be proud to put your name on." It took me until I was 63 and starting over in a small office with 2 employees to really understand what he meant. Not proud in the sense of impressive or profitable. Proud in the sense of true. Something that reflects what you actually believe and how you actually want to move through the world. Ellsworth & Co. turns 4 years old next spring. We have 61 properties under management, a staff of 9, and a waiting list of property owners who want to work with us. I am at my desk by 7:30 most mornings, and I still answer my own phone, which my staff thinks is eccentric and which I consider non-negotiable. I don't know what the next chapter looks like. I know Renata is happy, or closer to it than she's been in a while. I know my grandchildren call me Grandma Winnie, and that the 8-year-old has informed me she wants to manage buildings when she grows up, which I told her was a very solid career choice. I know that the photograph of Charles and me at the ribbon cutting is still on my desk, in the same frame, and that I look at it every morning when I sit down, and that I feel, not triumphant exactly, but something quieter and more durable than that. Grateful for the years we had, for the ones I've made since, for the fact that when it counted, I knew what I was worth, and I refused to let anyone convince me otherwise. That's the whole story. That's all there is to it, and that's enough. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the conference room, not the drive to my sister's house, not even the morning I signed the paperwork for Ellsworth & Co. It's a smaller moment than any of those. It's me sitting at Charles's old desk the night after Ruth told me the accounts didn't add up, looking at that ribbon-cutting photograph, and understanding that I had 2 choices. I could keep pretending I didn't see what I was seeing, or I could act like the person I'd spent 63 years becoming. I think about that a lot when I consider how things unfolded the way they did. Not luck, not accident. The way you respond to what's true in front of you. That's what determines where you end up. Preston made choices. I made choices. Renata made choices. And every one of those choices had a consequence that followed it as naturally as one season follows another. That's not fate or punishment. It's just how things work. Actions have weight. They land somewhere eventually. What I know about Preston is that he was not a stupid man. He was a man who mistook confidence for wisdom and impatience for decisiveness. He saw an aging woman who had just lost her husband, and he saw an opportunity. What he didn't see, what he fundamentally failed to understand, was that 32 years of doing something with integrity builds a kind of foundation that isn't visible from the outside. You can't take it over. You can't file paperwork against it. It lives in every vendor who trusts your word. Every tenant who knows you'll pick up the phone, every employee who's watched you do the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. That's the thing about character. It's not what you announce, it's what accumulates quietly over decades of small decisions. When the pressure came, and it came hard, I had something solid underneath me. Preston had a title and a strategy deck, and Renata. I think about my daughter. And I don't feel anger when I do anymore. What I feel is something closer to recognition. She was afraid. She loved someone, and she was afraid of what it would mean to choose differently. And fear makes people capable of things that would otherwise be impossible to imagine. What brought her back wasn't me being right. It was her own clarity returning, slowly, once the noise settled. That required something from her that I think was harder than anything I did. It required her to look honestly at what had happened and take responsibility for her part in it. That kind of honesty, turned on yourself, is not easy. I respect her for it more than I've told her. What I'd want anyone to take from this story, if I had to put it plainly, is that the 3 things that actually carried me through were not strategy, not legal documents, and not luck. They were knowing right from wrong and refusing to blur that line, even when it would have been convenient. Thinking clearly, even when I was scared, and making decisions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. And getting up every single morning during those hard years and doing the next necessary thing, even when I didn't feel like it, even when I wasn't sure it would matter. Those three things: your integrity, your clear head, and your willingness to keep going. Nobody can take those from you. They took a lot from me. But not those. I'm 65 now. Ellsworth & Co. has 61 properties and 9 people I trust completely. Renata and I have lunch every other Saturday. Her kids call me Grandma Winnie. That's the whole of it. That's what stayed.